Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. I'll end the war in 24 hours. Those were the words of President Donald Trump before he was re-elected to the White House. Now we have a minerals deal signed and apparently still live talks about ending the conflict. But a leaked peace proposal from Washington revealed that the US is willing to accept Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, along with the territory Russia currently occupies. It also apparently rules out Ukraine joining NATO. Yet, that has been followed by tougher language from the American camp towards Putin. So where are we in all this? And what should Ukraine make of it? Are there circumstances in which Ukraine should accept a deal that may not look great, but may be the best it should get? Well, to discuss this, and I really want to go into some detail on these choices, I'm joined by Orysia Lutsevych from Chatham House, who runs our Ukraine Forum that we are very proud of, and Matthew Savill from the Royal United Services Institute. Great to have you here. Let's plunge straight in, just briefly, with the minerals deal, which has just happened. Orysia, just tell us a bit about it and your view of it.
So Ukraine was trying to keep America engaged in supporting its resistance to Russia. And one of the pathways to this engagement was actually President Zelensky's idea to get U.S. investment flowing, knowing how transactional Trump is. And even before Trump's election, he was proposing this lucrative deal about the minerals. It was a bumpy road from this idea to actual signature yesterday. And Ukraine was able to convince America that there is a benefit in mutual doing business together, and they've pledged to set up this investment and reconstruction fund. And Ukraine also calibrated Americans' wishes for this fund. At the beginning, U.S. wanted the debt to be reconsidered for previous military assistance. The number was
saying, pay us back for what we've spent on you in defending.
What Biden has spent, in a way, with U.S. government. But Ukraine was able to push back. So the fund will only consider new deals. And also what's interesting, the American contribution into this fund could come in a military assistance. For example, air defense would be considered as U.S. contribution, which I think is a smart way to open a pathway for new mechanisms for delivering military assistance, not for free, but for business deals.
And I'm really struck by the tone that the Ukrainians have presented this in. We've had the Prime Minister of Ukraine saying, look, this is a good deal, it's an equal deal. And it does represent, it seems, some very big changes from the earlier versions of this mineral deal, which have gone through quite a few versions. But two big changes leapt out at me, that this is not supposed to be payment to the US for past spending on the war under Joe Biden. That one has gone. And there is actually language in there, it seems, from talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So not this language of either just talking about the conflict or indeed blaming Ukraine for the conflict.
It also interestingly mentions that countries who destroyed Ukraine through invasion will not be able to benefit from the reconstruction process. So that, in a way, proxy countries who are supplying weapons to Russia, semiconductors, and that includes North Korea, China, Iran, will not be able to benefit from this big economic project, which Ukraine's recovery will be. It will be an economic project of a century, definitely in the European continent.
There have obviously been a lot of hands in this deal, but I'm struck that the tone seems to have changed since the second famous encounter between Donald Trump and President Zelensky, sitting this time on chairs in the Vatican by the Pope's coffin, a now also famous photograph. Do you put some of that, the change of tone, down to that meeting or to the negotiations that have been going on behind the scenes?
I think specifically that conversation in the Vatican was more about the peace conversations, and it was very much the message that Putin cannot be trusted, that Putin plays you out. He is not genuinely interested in ending the war. His conditions are unreasonable. Neither Europe nor Ukraine can accept it, and we, as Ukraine, want to be your reliable and trusted partner, and that deal is in a way a trust-building, a confidence-building measure to show that Ukraine is willing to be constructive, to give something to Trump for his 100 days, to say they understand the populist nature of his governance and they want to say, Ukraine will pay us back. This is a good deal for American people.
I think you've put it in the right way there. And Ukraine, advised by all kinds of other countries, and indeed a US law firm has put a lot of work into that. And the phrase that Donald Trump did come out of that meeting with President Trump, saying maybe Russia is tapping me along. Let's use that as the background to talk about the wider prospects of a deal for peace. Matthew, where do you think we are?
Well, obviously, we're still in this slightly odd situation where we have the direct negotiations between the US and Russia, and the Ukrainians in the background of that process. And there's some talk about moving towards them actually having some sort of direct contact with the Russians. The Europeans seem to have forced themselves into the debate at last, although that's with Keith Kellogg, who's the special representative for Ukraine. So they're sort of playing this role in having technical discussions, and there's still this question of a coalition of the willing, which we can come back to, the military utility of that. So it's pretty messy, and I think if I were to characterise it, the problem as I see it is that the US is keen, I think genuinely President Trump is interested in a deal that ends the war. But the terms that are being discussed, frankly, look more like they are part of a cessation of violence that will be unstable. Because what they are aiming towards, not only does it not give either side what they necessarily want, which the US is framing as a compromise, and that's good, I think it means that a resumption of fighting in some form or another is still reasonably likely.
You're now Director of Military Sciences at RUSI, but you were previously with the Ministry of Defence. Can you just take us into your assessment of the battlefield position at the moment?
Yes, so what we've got is the way that the conflict has played out over the past 3 years. It has been changing each year. So from large-scale manoeuvre to Ukrainian counteroffensive to something that is now much more bogged down. So broadly speaking, you have now over 620,000 Russian forces arrayed along the front line, which still stretches...
Very long front line.
Indeed. It's over 1,000 kilometres, and it stretches slightly into Russia. There's this issue of how much of the Kursk incursion that the Ukrainians started last year is still left. Not very much. But it's a long front line. They have a large ground force, and they still have part of the Black Sea Fleet operating, constrained. They still have a very active Russian Air Force, but it doesn't have control of the air. And arrayed against that are probably maybe 800,000 mobilised Ukrainians, but a much smaller force actually along the front line in combat terms, maybe less than half of that the Russians have. And what is now I hesitate to call it static, but a not very dynamic front line. And it's characterised now by very small groups of largely infantry sort of scrabbling over ground, trying to eke out an advantage. Very still attritional, bloody conflict. And that is because the evolution of drones and other sensors and the way that artillery can still be brought to bear and some air power on the Russian side means it's really hard to mass large forces and then attack. So defence has kind of had the advantage for probably 18 months now.
By defence, you mean Ukrainian defence?
The first time we saw this was actually when the Ukrainians tried to counterattack, and they came up against these prepared, deep Russian defences, very, very thick, minefields, obstacles, and in essence, it's incredibly hard to force your way through that. And now what's happened is that the Russians have begun to push. They've had this long period of nearly a year now of grinding their way forwards, and that has been achieved at an incredibly high cost. Now, it's a cost that the Russians are prepared to pay at the moment. And when we say high cost, they have, for the past, say, 6 months or so, probably been averaging 1,500 casualties a day. That's a mixture of dead and...
Just think, I mean, that is a huge number.
Yes. So if you put the entire British army at the moment is around 72,000. So it would be essentially non-combat effective in a couple of months under those conditions. And, if you kept on fighting, it would be destroyed in under 6 months. And so that's the level of casualties that we're talking about. The Ukrainians aren't suffering them at that rate, but they are suffering casualties. And the Russians have not been taking large amounts of territory recently. They've kind of slowed to a crawl, so maybe 600 square kilometres over the past 100 days since Trump came in. But that is set in the context of that's about a 0.5% increase in the territory they can control. So they've gone from 18.5% to 90% of Ukraine that they control. but they're trying to kill as many Ukrainians because fundamentally their view is they can take these casualties. They are astonishingly callous with their infantry.
And they are a larger country with more people.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just before we come on to the deal, just one more thing on this. What is Ukraine's ability to keep fighting? And I have in the back of my mind, President Trump's threat to walk away potentially from this.
The first thing the Ukrainians have is national will. This is an existential fight for them. There is no sign that the Russians have drawn back from their ambition, which is fundamentally to reabsorb Ukraine into what it would see as its sphere of influence, prevent a drift towards the West, break the back of its ability to be an independent country, and to replace it with a more malleable government. Those are quite maximalist goals, but that's what the Russians want, and it's what they're still aiming for. So in the face of that, Ukrainians have an incredible will to fight. They also have probably a higher quality average across their forces. They've mobilized a lot of older people who aren't necessarily in prime fighting age, and training is variable, but compared to the way that the Russian infantry are fighting, they are fundamentally probably better. International support has been a huge boon. The question is, what does that enable them to do? The tapering off of US materiel support, which was just under half by value, and
under half of the military support,
of the military support
overall,
yeah. So Europe actually provides slightly more than the US by value.
And again, specifically of the military support.
Of the military support, actually.
Before we get into aid and all kinds of other things.
Europe provides actually much more overall. What the US provide is, the key advantage is some particularly sophisticated weapon systems, a consistency of type. The Europeans provide lots of different types of armoured vehicles and tanks. Things like the most capable and longest range air defence missiles, Patriot, are either from America or they are, countries like Germany operate them, but they're on licence from America. And then the intelligence feed, which hasn't been, we don't know in public much of the detail of that, but we know it's pretty important.
And in those few days when Donald Trump turned it off, it appeared to have quite a damaging effect on Ukraine's ability to target.
Yeah, so the anecdotal feedback that came in was that not only did it affect targeting, but lots of just the volume of threat intelligence, the kind of signals intelligence or other warnings and indications that the US provides into the Ukrainian system. That was noticed at the front line. Now, Europe could step up and do more in all these cases, but it's never going to be able to replace by volume that kind of sophisticated intelligence and space-based imagery, for example. It can't, at the moment and in the short term, replicate the capability of some of those sophisticated missiles, and it will still, for the time being, be providing lots of differentiated types of equipment. It is stepping up on artillery shells, for example, but lots of that comes from the US as well. So the key thing is Ukraine can stay in the fight with only European support. But 2025 would be a pretty difficult year. It probably would be trying to hold the line, but finding it's this sort of incremental loss of territory. I think the big thing would be, could there be a European effort supporting on training and rebuilding them in capacity terms?
So we'll come on in a moment to what Europe can do as we begin to talk about the deal itself. But Orysia, just filling out this picture of where things are right at the moment. You go to Kyiv and other places in Ukraine a lot. What about this point about still the public willingness to fight in what is an existential fight? Obviously fighting for their country. On the other hand, people looking at their children and thinking, do I want my children to be called up into this?
Yeah, I think to complete the picture to what Matthew described, it's important to remember that it's a total war also against the civilian population. And it was John Healey in his statement in the parliament. He said that just this year,
He is our defense secretary here in the UK.
Russia launched 10,000 missiles and drones just this year. So I think on average, somebody calculated that throughout the war, it's 22 missiles and drones a day. And some of these are very powerful ballistic missiles that cause huge damage that Ukraine cannot intercept. And that is why U.S. assistance in Patriot missiles is so important, because in order to sustain some kind of normalcy of life, for people to send their children to school, for companies to operate, it's important to have this sky shield of Patriot systems that will enable Ukraine to withstand the pressure. And that Europe can partially only replaced, but it doesn't have enough of those capabilities. And the last thing I'll say is that the total mobilization of society also remains. You have all kinds of stories from, people volunteering, not just younger, but older people. For example, they are printing parts for the drones on their 3D printers at home, using postal services then to dispatch them to a place they don't even know what are they doing. It's like a blockchain drone production. And what is interesting is that, of course, why we're having this stalemate on the battlefield, because of the technological parity that the sides are reaching, and total visibility of the battlefield means Russians actually slowing down their territorial gains, but Ukrainians still cannot make this breakthrough in technology in order to protect, especially with electronic warfare, kind of create these bubbles around their fields, the battle groups, to enable them either to be more effective in combat or in defense. I think Ukraine is also ramping up its domestic production, something very important. So the plan B for Ukraine is not just Europe, it's also its own defense industry. And now I think they produce between 30 to 40% of what they use on the battlefield at home.
That is a really important point, and they have made the point to us and on public stages. Look, we are the biggest active fighting force in NATO at the moment, and we have a lot of experience.
I should have said, the point that was being made there is that there has actually in some respects been an intensification of the Russian attack, the Russian war against Ukraine, even since Trump came in. So I think the largest missile and drone barrage was actually December last year, but since then we've had 3 or 4 where there have been huge numbers of weapons launched. So 130, 140 drones in a single night. That's happened in the past 10 days, accompanied also by cruise and ballistic missiles. The average has jumped. The size of the attack, I think, is up by about a third in the past 3 months. So although that's not like the sort of the winter campaigns purely against power generation, just the level of weapons being hurled at civilian cities, including Kyiv, has actually spiked. And so, there are different ways to interpret that. Is the Russians in a hurry to try and increase the pressure before cutting a deal? Or are they actually kind of making a point about their willingness to just keep escalating to get Trump to put the pressure back on the Ukrainians? But this is not a conflict that is petering out.
That is a really good point. And of course, one of those attacks produced this extraordinary social media post from Donald Trump saying, "Stop, Vladimir," a first sign that his views might change. Though "Stop, Vladimir" is not exactly the way you want to go about ending a conflict. Let's go on now to talk about the core of this, what a deal to end the conflict might talk about. And we haven't had any official release of what Trump's peace plan might be, but some details have been leaked or emerged. These include immediate ceasefire, direct talks between Moscow and Kyiv. However, the plan also reportedly involves the US recognizing Russian sovereignty over annexed Crimea and informally acknowledging Russian control over the territory it currently occupies in Ukraine, though not more territory, and it would also bar Ukraine from joining NATO. I'd like to ask each of you what you think of that.
I think it's a significant departure from U.S. policy of non-recognition of illegally occupied territories back from the times of the USSR, when United States was not recognizing occupation of the Baltic states.
And let's be clear, the principle of sovereignty and not taking territory by force, part of the UN Charter, which pretty well every country has signed up to.
Exactly, in a staged referendum under the gun barrel, pretending it wasn't even a military operation. But I think it's a significant departure from that upholding of the basic principle. And the question is, why would Trump be willing to give this to Putin when, as we've described previously, Putin is not winning on the battlefield? He has not won the battle for Crimea. Actually, Ukrainians destroyed almost 30% of Russian Black Sea fleet. His position is weakened in the Black Sea. Ukraine was able to unblock the trade corridor. The question, why now give him Crimea on a silver platter, where he will, using that new status of the territory, remilitarize, threaten the whole of Mediterranean, use Crimean airfields for campaigns elsewhere, including in the Middle East. What's in it for America? So I think the Europeans are already very clear, and Kaja Kallas said yesterday, Europe will never recognize Russian status of Crimea. Ukraine clearly will never recognize, because president, that is the guarantor of the constitution, cannot legally do it. He cannot relinquish territories like that.
To be clear, the US is not asking other countries to doing it. It's simply thrown it in there as part of the mix. that it will do so.
So here's the main question where I think the danger lies in this proposition that came from Trump to agreement to Putin's narrative. Isn't he asking the same or potentially asking the same for Greenland? Is there quid pro quo, this kind of illegal annexations that they would legitimize through this superpower consensus? That was the only thing that I thought would be in for America.
It's a really interesting point, and we don't have time really or space in a sense to go into President Trump's territorial ambitions, which include Canada. But Matthew, what did you make of these details that have emerged? And I should say we have not seen the final version.
In many respects, you're always vulnerable, particularly with the sort of the Trump administration, with how much of this is posturing and what's actually going on scenes, and how to therefore interpret what the Russians are saying, and what Witkoff is. But I think first of all, we act on the sort of the starter recognition, which probably shouldn't lie, that the US has gone from being a backer of Ukraine to saying it is essentially neutral in this, as if it has no role in it. It is a significant net loss for Ukraine. And the US is trying to present itself as we're just a neutral broker in the middle of this. And that is a win for Russia, fundamentally, in and of itself. The second thing is, and this is geopolitics, so it's less my area, but there is a strong danger that this is the pebble that starts, or in the case of the US, the boulder that starts the avalanche, by which I mean some of the terms are kind of, if you could say, they're reflections of reality. Crimea is not to be taken by force anytime soon. Neither all the way back to the borders, and take back Donetsk and Luhansk anytime soon. And it's not joining NATO anytime soon, because at the point at which it joins NATO, it is essentially redrawing its boundaries if it wants to actually do that. De jure accepting all of this, and if the US does it, will introduce enormous friction in Europe, because we know actually the European position is actually quite fractured. There are people who just want this to be over with and who don't want to stick in.
And to be clear, what is the avalanche you're talking about?
It would be the fracturing of the international coalitions in support of Ukraine, or people who are kind of opposed to European support but are kind of keeping out of the way, a bit like the way that I think it's the Hungarians always sort of seem to absent themselves whenever there's the vote.
It could be worse.
It could be worse.
They could be there.
I think it can also achieve what Putin wants, is to break up this transatlantic remaining alliance. It's already fragile for different reasons, but this would be like a last nail in the coffin, because there will be fundamental difference on.
And we're having a lot of interesting conversations, not just about how Russia can put wedges into Europe, but how China quite actively is doing that, and all kinds of other fronts, and that is a big and interesting conversation. But on the other hand, you could say, particularly on defence and security, the European Union it's a long time since it's been acting as one, and this Ukraine challenge has exposed that, but it's also actively brought in countries like the UK that said, OK, we're not part of the European Union, but we're going to be part of that. And you could, I guess, more positively turn it round and say this then throws it down to Europe to say, well, which of you are going to back Ukraine in this?
It has actively, in some cases, prompted soul-searching increased defence spending, which was happening already, but on a very slow trajectory. So the Trump administration always claims credit for the increased spending amongst European NATO members. Well, that was started in 2014 before his administration, but he added a bit of pressure and it kind of accelerated. And in some respects, Europe is beginning to think, that the French would say they were always right to talk about more strategic autonomy, at least having an ability to operate without the US. Across European militaries, there are enormous dependencies or risks that are brought out by US capability. The bit where that clashes into the instincts of the Trump administration, though, is that on the one hand, they are telling Europe, be more responsible for your own security, do more on your own security. On the other hand, that means Europe probably spending not nothing, but less on US defence industry, more on its own, and doing more things in its own way. And you've got this contradiction, which is that the US has been expressing frustration that Europe is trying to keep Europe in the fight. Stop trying to mess around with our peace deal by stiffening the sinews of the Ukrainians. Well, that's just a contradiction.
And I'd add another contradiction, that it's telling Europe to do more to defend itself against Russia. The only direct threat to Europe in that sense at the moment. And yet, in some of this, certainly in language and possibly in terms of this deal, been doing things like lifting sanctions or proposing to lift sanctions, but actually been doing things that could significantly help Russia.
Indeed. And to dive back in, sorry, because I didn't really answer your question, on the terms of the deal, the reason why I think it's unstable is because where it's drawing the line is tremendously inconvenient, fundamentally. We know the Russians want the 4 oblasts that they essentially annexed under their...
These are the eastern districts, and it has big bites of each of them.
Zaporizhia and Kherson, I think. And I don't think they control the totality of any of them. Like, it's 98% in some cases. It's a reasonable chunk of Zaporizhia. Of course, they've got the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is enormously important for Ukraine. And so where the line is drawn, like it's just an administrative nightmare. And you can see the Russians actually saying, well, could we just inch forward in a few places? And
so I think many people find that very persuasive, that this deal, if it happens, may not stick, that it may stick for 6, 7, 8 years and then reopen. But just before that, I just want to stick on this point of whether Ukraine should accept such a deal or whether it would be better to say no and try to go it alone with European support. Orysia, what's your view?
I think Ukraine wants to give talks a chance, and they believe that what is interesting is there are 2 plans. There's European Ukraine plans, which we didn't talk about, and there's this American plan. But one point that coincides in 2 plans is the immediate ceasefire, to actually have confidence, to have conversation without duress.
And a conversation directly with Moscow.
It could be a conversation with Moscow. It could be quadrilateral with Ukraine, Europe, America, Moscow. It could be some tracks bilateral. All of this could be structured. But first, Russia must agree to an unconditional ceasefire, and Russia doesn't agree to that. So for Ukraine, I think what Ukraine would be willing to concede, if you want, compromise. Of course, Ukraine is ready to discuss the status of territories. It doesn't say we're going to go military retake it, but what is the status of people living? What is the access humanitarian organizations have? What's happening with children? And then the next phase, yes. Ukraine,
and by this, crucially, you mean whether the people can leave?
Of course, whether people can retain their Ukrainian citizenship. All of this, Ukraine is ready to discuss. Doesn't seem to me like Russia is willing to do it, because all Russia wants to do is wants to absorb these, Russify these territories, destroy any sign of Ukrainian spirit there, if you want, and make life, hell on earth there for people. But that's one thing Ukraine is willing to compromise, to have a conversation. Another one is this NATO piece. Ukraine's NATO membership is written Ukrainian constitution. That is the goal. So, but Ukraine says, okay, if NATO is not ready, we are prepared to design a different kind of security arrangement.
These talks have apparently left on the table, and Russia has actually agreed in public that Ukraine could be part of the European Union, which does bring some mutual defense obligations with it.
It's interesting. I think Russians are trying to confuse everything, to drag time, because Lavrov recently said Ukraine again has to demilitarize.
This is the foreign minister of Russia, famously.
The foreign minister said, so they kind of like jump up to, again, the highest bar of their demands. Then Witkov and Putin have conversations which we don't know what it is about.
A whole load of noise. But just still, in your view, and you've described Ukraine's willing to talk, but in your view, is this at this moment the kind of deal Ukraine can accept?
I don't think Ukraine can accept this deal in this current arrangement. It needs much more detail that should be worked out, and Ukraine and Europeans should be at the table, because the guaranteeing any kind of a deal looks like it will be a job of Ukraine jointly with Europeans. And the tug of war between the two is whether Americans are willing to be part of any kind of reassurance force in terms of backing it up. We know that UK is very reluctant to engage in such military operations without US backing. All of this is being discussed. Nothing is settled yet.
And presumably for Ukraine, Matthew, I'm going back to your earlier point that Ukraine, in a sense, probably could fight on, at least for this year, without direct US help. But it needs some kind of help, doesn't it? It needs European help. Does it need a presence of European forces, or just a huge injection into its own capacity?
I think it could do with both. I find it a bit difficult to say what Ukraine should do, because it feels a bit presumptuous to sort of say...
Well, and we're going to be, if this happens at all, very much in the shoulds have gone out the window some time ago.
I think if the current, effectively, the front line and the terms as described were to be locked in, I think that would be an enormous political problem for Zelensky to swallow and a big problem for the country to just write off 20% and to have the front lines where they are, because in some cases the Russians on sort of higher ground, they can threaten down places like Kramatorsk, Sloviansk are essentially, under threat. I think if it is assumed that this is a temporary cessation, Ukraine could do with that fundamentally, a chance to reset, rebuild. Its big problem at the moment is it really struggles to get forces off.
Temporary, are you talking 30 days or 6 years? Or
months or maybe a couple of years. Now, there's a problem that Russia can rebuild as well. But the big Ukrainian problem is they struggle to get their forces off the front line, to give them a break and to rebuild, essentially. They've got a thriving internal defence industry that's producing things like drones, and they're looking at their own ballistic missiles and their own cruise missiles. But big international support would genuinely make a difference.
So they still need that. Do they need boots on the ground from other countries?
I mean, what they would love is European forces coming in large numbers.
And Russia said no to that, but still European countries are spending a bit of time talking to each other about that, so that's not dead yet.
No, but it looks like they're leaning back towards something that has some kind of air and maritime policing role and then a training and capacity building function. And that would be of value. It's not the kind of deterrent force that they would like, but that was always a bit of a dubious concept. But something that is big and really substantial, that helps, that moves all of that training and capacity building into country and makes them a much tougher target in the future, would be of enormous benefit. And this is why you've got this absurdity of Russia and the US negotiating over the heads of Ukraine and the Europeans and effectively telling Ukraine and Europe what kind of future relationship they can have in terms of the presence of European personnel. That's surely a decision for a sovereign Ukraine, not for the Russians to dictate what they can do with that bit of their country. And so that will be an indicator of where the US is leaning, if it's actually prepared to kind of enforce that or not.
Yeah, I think right now the big crux of it is whether the US will be willing to be part of any security arrangements for Ukraine. I think Europeans would feel much safer, more confident. It would be a much more serious guarantee if US is involved. How is it arranged? I think this is what Starmer is really working hard with Macron to convince Trump that it's not about boots on the ground, but we could have elements of US support.
What do you mean by elements? Because I'm surprised you say that, in that I had taken that as being off the table, really, any kind of substantial engagement.
That is not what the US has on the table from Europe. Elements could include logistics support, intelligence support, Air Force support, out of the airfields on NATO territory. This is where the conversation is.
We're getting really close to the end, and yet I just want both of you, I mean, you're giving more energy and detail to this sense of a deal, the discussions around a deal, than we might have expected several months ago. And I'm really struck by that. I love your sense of the likelihood of it, particularly considering Russia's point of view, that black box that is called what Putin might do.
I'm a bit sceptical. I'm prepared to be surprised, so I wouldn't say there's no chance. But the Europeans have slightly ceded agency on this by, from the very start, saying this will only happen if there is what they called a US backstop. Confusing language, but basically they meant, will the US support this, and will there be some kind of US interaction with it, which might be intelligence and logistics, but that's not a security guarantee. And I mean, this is almost like the debate over the Budapest Memorandum, which was security assurances in the US translation, which meant, yes, we think Ukrainian security is important, but we're not saying we're going to do anything about it. And I'm struggling to see. Europe has made pretty clear it's not prepared to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. Same with the US. So a guarantee of, if Russia attacks you again, we will intervene, that's not coming. Okay, so can they put in forces that would somehow trigger a response? Seems unlikely that the US would sign up to that. It would probably tell the Europeans, you're on your own here. And Europe appears to lack the political will to take that risk, given its other commitments.
So
that's
all
not
of this,
impossible.
just driving towards this point of whether there is really room for a deal there, or whether the two sides are essentially very far apart.
The problem is I think that all of the incentives at the moment are towards a deal that is more favourable towards Russia, because it will leave quite ambiguous the level of future support that Ukraine. I don't think there's a security guarantee. I mean, the best they could potentially hope for is some kind of trigger that the US would come back with big sanctions, and that it would risk
in your
that relationship.
In your view, at this point, should Ukraine accept that?
I think Ukraine and the Europeans should plan on the assumption that Russia will be coming back for more in the next few years, and think about how they can prepare for that, such as that they're in a position to militarily take advantage of it.
I think if Trump will not put pressure on Russia, nothing of this sort will take place. I personally think that Putin is so confident that so far Trump internalized his agenda that he doesn't need to concede anything. He doesn't need to play nice. He can play this show of strength to his own people and vis-a-vis Trump. And I think something very critical that must happen as these talks go on is do not relax attention on the defense and military complex, both in Ukraine and in Europe, because that's the only way that be able to curtail or deter Russian ambition. Russians are very, focused on capabilities, how many tanks, how many missiles they have, and then they will calibrate their action. And remember, for Russia, diplomacy and battlefield are in fusion.
Forgive me, we're coming right to the end, but still President Zelensky may have an extremely difficult choice of whether to accept a bad deal, knowing that it may not hold, but knowing that it may be the best that he gets at this point.
It's possible, but right now he has Ukrainian society backing him, and it gives him confidence to actually fight for a better deal.
We're going to have to leave it there. I was in Washington last week and asking lots of different people, even the IMF finance crowd, what they thought was behind the affinity, if I can put it that way, that President Trump has shown for President Putin. And so many described it as one of the big mysteries in this, of just why he as a person, not just the US, has chosen to do that at this point. Though going back to one of Matthew's very first points, I think there is a genuine desire, for whatever reason, to try to end a conflict. We're going to have to stop there. Thank you so much for joining us for Independent Thinking from Chatham House. If you enjoyed this one, please leave us a review, or even better, tell us what you'd like us to talk about next. We love hearing your thoughts on that. The producer this week was Amanda Nunn. I'm Bronwen Maddox. Speak to you next week. Bye for now.